Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly chilling journey deep into the heart of medieval Europe, a land dominated by the pervasive influence of the Christian Church, its towering cathedrals, and its countless monasteries. But we're not focusing on the grand ceremonies or the illuminated manuscripts. Instead, we're pulling back the rough woolen habit to uncover the brutal and silent life of a medieval nun. Forget serene contemplation, joyous hymns, or a peaceful escape from worldly woes. You're about to discover a grim reality where a young woman's destiny was irrevocably seized by divine decree, condemning her to a lifelong path of profound personal sacrifice, relentless discipline, and often a terrifying isolation. This wasn't a glamorous calling, it was a sacred burden, a spiritual prison that many might have wished to escape. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive the initial entry into the convent without longing for a simpler, less pious, and far less restrictive life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in the cold, damp cloisters of a medieval convent, perhaps in 12th century France or England. The air is thick with the scent of damp stone, beeswax candles, and the faint, ever-present aroma of stale incense. The only sounds are the hushed rustle of habits, the distant murmur of chanted prayers, and the chilling silence that seems to permeate every corner. You are not a visitor. You are a young girl, perhaps only 12 or 13 years old, recently arrived at the convent. And your new life, a life of profound and often involuntary commitment, has just begun. This is a forced calling, where your childhood abruptly ends, and your destiny is chosen for you. The reasons why a young girl would enter a medieval convent were complex and often had little to do with a fervent, personal religious calling in the modern sense. For many, particularly during the early and high Middle Ages, it was a decision driven by necessity, family strategy, or even outright coercion. Financial reasons, lack of dowry. This was perhaps the most common reason in medieval society. Daughters from noble or wealthy merchant families required a substantial dowry to secure a suitable marriage if a family had too many daughters, or faced financial hardship. They might struggle to provide adequate dowries for all. Sending a daughter to a convent known as a spiritual dowry or dos spiritualis was often a much cheaper alternative. The convent would require a smaller financial contribution, a dowry, to the institution itself, often much less than a secular marriage dowry, but it removed the daughter from the marriage market, ensuring she was provided for without further burdening the family. Imagine your parents calculating the cost of your marriage versus your monastic life, and choosing the cheaper option for family solvency. It truly sucked to be cheaper than a husband. Political, the social strategy. Powerful families might send daughters to convents to gain influence within the church, to secure prayers for their lineage, or to ensure that daughters who could not make advantageous political marriages, due to disability, lack of beauty, or simply too many siblings, were honorably provided for. Some daughters might even be sent temporarily during periods of political instability for their safety, only to find themselves unable to leave, coercion, or family pressure. While canon law nominally required a woman's consent to take vows, in practice, this consent was often nominal, especially for young girls. Parents might compel a daughter to enter a convent using persuasion, emotional blackmail, or even direct force if it served the family's interests. A girl might be too young to fully understand the lifelong implications of her vows, or too intimidated to refuse her parents' will. Imagine being told that God had called you, when in reality, your family had made the decision for you. It truly sucked to be forced into piety. Widowhood or disgrace for older women, particularly widows who did not wish to remarry or who lacked family support. Or for women who had suffered some social disgrace, a scandal, an unwanted pregnancy. The convent offered a refuge, a respectable alternative to destitution or societal condemnation. For them, it might be a choice of last resort, offering security and a structured life when other options vanished. Genuine calling, rare for the youngest. While personal piety and a true spiritual calling certainly motivated some women, especially older ones, to enter convents, this was likely less common for the very young girls committed by their families, a genuine, fully informed. Vocational calling was often something that developed over time, not something a child could unilaterally decide. Once accepted, your life was immediately and irrevocably transformed. You underwent a period of novitiate, usually a year, a probationary period where you learned the monastic rules, spiritual practices, and daily routines. This was followed by the ceremony of profession, where you took your final, lifelong vows. These vows, chastity, poverty, and obedience, were unbreakable in the eyes of the church. Leaving the convent without papal dispensation, which was extremely rare and difficult to obtain, was considered a grave sin, a betrayal of God, and could lead to severe spiritual and secular penalties. Your freedom, if you ever had any, was extinguished by your solemn oath. It really sucked to make a lifelong vow as a teenager. The convent walls became your entire world. You were physically and socially separated from your family, from secular society, and from any hope of marriage or motherhood, your past life, your individual desires, your personal dreams all were systematically relinquished, replaced by a collective identity as a servant of God and a member of the monastic community. Your unique personality was expected to be subsumed by the monastic ideal, ensuring obedience and spiritual focus. The initial process of integration was often jarring. You would trade your customary clothes for the simple, often rough, woolen habit of the order. Your hair, a symbol of femininity, would be cut short or covered by a wimple. Your days would become strictly regimented by the divine office, a rigid schedule of prayers that began in the middle of the night. This abrupt transition from childhood to rigid monastic discipline was a profound shock to your system, both physically and psychologically. One common misconception is that all medieval nuns were wealthy noblewomen, while convents did attract daughters from aristocratic and wealthy families who could afford the spiritual dowry and sought influence. Many nuns also came from middle-class or gentry families. The wealth and prestige of a convent varied widely, with some being highly endowed and others quite modest. The social background of the nuns often influenced the intellectual and economic life of the convent, but the basic monastic vows and daily routines applied to all. Historians still meticulously study monastic charters, convent records, and aristocratic family histories to understand the precise social and economic motivations for women entering convents, revealing a diverse array of reasons beyond purely religious calling. Furthermore, the very concept of a spiritual spouse, Christ, that a nun was supposed to embrace, while offering theological comfort, also underscored the complete denial of human intimacy and romantic love. You were expected to channel all your affections and desires towards God, suppressing any natural human yearnings for physical or emotional connection with another person. This profound redirection of human instinct, demanded from a young age, was a constant, subtle psychological burden, defining your emotional landscape for a lifetime. The physical environment of the convent, typically cold. Damp stone buildings, as discussed in the episode about castles, also contributed to the harshness of your new life. You would sleep on hard beds, often with minimal bedding, in unheated cells or communal dormitories. This austere physical reality, designed to promote humility and detachment from worldly comforts, was a constant source of physical discomfort, making your daily life a perpetual exercise in endurance. So, your commitment to becoming a medieval nun began not with a purely personal calling, but with a terrifying, forced calling that abruptly seized your childhood and plunged you into a destiny utterly beyond your control. This initial act of commitment, driven by family necessity, social strategy, or outright coercion, bound you for life to profound personal sacrifice, relentless discipline, and an unwavering adherence to a sacred role that transformed you into a servant of God, making it an undeniably brutal and silent life from its very inception. Having been abruptly committed to a monastic life and taken your solemn vows, you, the young nun, were immediately immersed in a world of profound and relentless personal sacrifice. Forget any lingering dreams of marriage, family, or worldly pleasures. Your new existence was defined by perpetual chastity, absolute poverty, and unwavering obedience. Vows that made your sacred role an undeniably brutal and silent life. Imagine the day of your profession, the solemn ceremony where you took your final, lifelong vows. You would kneel before the altar, surrounded by your new sisters and the officiating clergy. You would publicly renounce the world, its temptations, and its pleasures. The vows were explicit and terrifying in their permanence. Chastity castitas. You pledged lifelong celibacy, renouncing any form of romantic love, sexual intimacy, or physical desire. Your body, once a vessel for human procreation and affection, was now dedicated solely to God. This wasn't merely a private promise, it was a public, sacred oath, the very foundation of your ritual purity and your spiritual devotion. You were expected to channel all your affections and desires towards Christ, your spiritual spouse. Imagine denying your most fundamental human instincts for decades, living a life deliberately devoid of physical intimacy and maternal fulfillment. This profound denial, especially for a young woman, was a constant, internal struggle, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of spiritual fervor could fully assuage. It truly sucked to sacrifice your entire future for a spiritual ideal. Poverty, paupertas. You renounced all personal property and material possessions, everything you owned, from the clothes on your back to any family inheritance, was relinquished upon entering the convent. You would now live communally, sharing all resources with your sisters, wearing simple, often coarse, woolen or linen habits, and possessing only what was necessary for your monastic duties. This wasn't just about giving up wealth, it was about surrendering all personal attachment to earthly goods, cultivating detachment and reliance solely on God and the community. Imagine giving up every comfort, every personal belonging, to embrace a life of deliberate material deprivation. It truly sucked to be rich in spirit but poor in everything else. Obedience. Obedientia, you pledged absolute, unquestioning obedience to your abbess, the head of the convent, to the rules of your monastic order, e.g., the rule of Saint Benedict, and to the will of God as interpreted by your superiors. This meant surrendering your personal will, your independent judgment, and your autonomy. Every aspect of your daily life when you woke, what you ate, what you studied, where you went. What tasks you performed would be dictated by the monastic rule and the commands of your abbess. You were expected to follow orders without hesitation or complaint, cultivating humility and submission. Imagine having your entire day, your entire life, dictated by rules and orders, with no room for personal choice or spontaneity. It truly sucked to have your will be utterly subjugated. These 3 vows formed the very bedrock of your monastic existence, transforming you from an individual into a dedicated servant of God. They were lifelong commitments, considered unbreakable in the eyes of the Church. Leaving the convent without papal dispensation was virtually impossible and considered a grave sin, a betrayal of God, leading to severe spiritual excommunication and secular imprisonment, social ostracization penalties. Your freedom, if you ever had any, was extinguished by your solemn oath, binding you for all eternity. The psychological toll of these vows, particularly chastity and obedience, would be immense. You would live surrounded by a society that celebrated marriage, family, and personal freedom, while your own life was a profound denial of these fundamental human experiences. The constant awareness of your sacrifices, of the natural human yearnings you were suppressing, would create an ongoing internal struggle, leading to feelings of loneliness, unfulfilled longing, or a profound sense of self-denial. Your identity as an individual woman would be subsumed by your role as a bride of Christ, a living embodiment of the divine, ensuring you were revered but perhaps never truly seen as a whole person. The monastic rule, like the rule of Saint Benedict for Benedictine nuns, one of the most common orders, was meticulously detailed, governing every aspect of your life. It dictated the hours of prayer, the types of food, the periods of silence, the duties to be performed, and even the manner in which you were to interact with others. This rigid structure, while providing a sense of order and spiritual purpose, also left little to no room for personal autonomy, creativity outside prescribed forms, or spontaneous human connection. You were a living symbol, a sacred vessel, rather than a free individual with personal desires. One common misconception is that all medieval nuns willingly chose the monastic life out of deep personal piety, while genuine religious calling certainly motivated some women, particularly older ones or those seeking intellectual pursuits often denied to women in secular life. A significant number of young girls were committed to convents by their families for practical reasons, as discussed in Chapter 1, such as financial constraints, saving on dowries, political strategies gaining influence with the church, or providing a respectable alternative for unmarried or undesirable daughters. This means that for many, their vows were taken without full understanding or genuine consent, adding a profound layer of involuntary sacrifice to their lifelong commitment. Historians still meticulously study monastic charters, convent financial records, and aristocratic family histories to understand the precise social, economic, and spiritual motivations for women entering convents, often finding a complex interplay of personal choice and family societal pressure. Furthermore, the very physical environment of the convent, typically cold, damp stone buildings as we discussed with castles, contributed to the austerity of your life. You would sleep on hard beds, often with minimal bedding, in unheated cells or communal dormitories. This austere physical reality, designed to promote humility and detachment from worldly comforts, was a constant source of discomfort, making your daily life a perpetual exercise in endurance, reminding you of your vow of poverty with every shiver. The communal aspect of monastic life, while theoretically offering companionship, also had its limitations. While you lived alongside your sisters, the strict rules of silence, which we'll explore in Chapter 6, and the emphasis on spiritual contemplation often limited opportunities for deep, personal conversations or emotional intimacy. Your bonds were forged through shared prayer and labor, but often lacked the uninhibited closeness of secular friendships. Contributing to a sense of underlying loneliness, the psychological burden of maintaining perfect chastity, especially for decades, in a world where marriage and family were the norm, would be immense. Any natural human desires would have to be relentlessly suppressed, potentially leading to internal conflict, frustration, or even spiritual distress if you felt you were failing in your vows. The fear of breaking your sacred oath, which could lead to severe spiritual and secular penalties like public shame or imprisonment, would be a constant, gnawing anxiety, ensuring your rigorous self-control. So, your commitment to becoming a medieval nun was profoundly defined by perpetual chastity, absolute poverty, and unwavering obedience. These lifelong vows requiring profound personal sacrifice, the denial of fundamental human desires, and the complete subjugation of your will were undeniably brutal aspects of your sacred role. Your existence became a continuous act of personal denial, a relentless dedication to a spiritual ideal that consumed your entire being, making your life a silent testament to profound personal sacrifice. Having taken your profound vows, your new life as a medieval nun was immediately enveloped by the physical reality of your monastic home, the cell. Forget luxurious chambers or cozy solitude. Your dwelling was an austere, cramped, and often perpetually cold space designed for spiritual contemplation through physical discomfort, making your commitment an undeniably brutal and silent life. Imagine your cell, your new, permanent dwelling within the convent's cloistered walls. For many nuns, especially in larger, older convents, a cell was a small, unheated, and sparsely furnished room. It was typically made of thick stone, perpetually damp and chilling, radiating a constant cold that seeped into your bones. Regardless of the season, there might be a narrow, unglazed window slit, offering minimal natural light and allowing drafts to whistle through, exacerbating the chill. You were enclosed, physically separated from the outside world, your private space designed for introspection, but also for constant, subtle discomfort. It truly sucked to have your home be a refrigerator. Your furnishings would be sparse, reflecting your vow of poverty and promoting detachment from worldly comforts. You would likely sleep on a hard wooden pallet or a straw mattress, placed directly on the cold stone floor, with only rough wool blankets for warmth. There would be no soft pillows, no comfortable bed frame. Your sleep would be perpetually restless, interrupted by the cold, the hardness of your bed, and the demanding schedule of the divine office, which we'll discuss in Chapter 4. Imagine waking in the deep, freezing darkness of the night, your body stiff and aching from the hard surface. Already dreading the next round of prayers, it truly sucked to sleep on medieval concrete. The lack of heating in your cell was a deliberate practice, designed to promote asceticism and humility, while some communal areas like the refectory dining hall or the calefactory warming room, often the only heated room in the convent, might have a fireplace. Individual cells rarely did. This meant you were perpetually battling the cold, your breath fogging in the frigid air of your cell, your fingers numb, making tasks like reading or writing incredibly difficult. This constant physical discomfort was seen as a way to remind you of your vows and to focus your mind on spiritual matters. But it was physically draining. Sanitation in your cell was rudimentary at best. There would be no private latrine, You would share communal privies, outhouses, often located in a separate wing of the convent or outside, which were rarely cleaned thoroughly and would contribute to a pervasive stench in those areas. Your personal hygiene would be basic, limited by access to cold water and simple soaps. This communal and primitive sanitation meant that your cell, however diligently you tried to keep it clean, would always carry a subtle dampness and perhaps the lingering odors from the rest of the monastery, contributing to a general sense of being perpetually unclean despite spiritual purity. It truly sucked to smell like everyone else's shared hygiene issues. The darkness in your cell was pervasive. Windows were narrow, high, and often unglazed or covered with thin parchment, designed for defense and to limit worldly distractions, not to let in abundant light. Much of your day would be spent in dim light, and after dusk. Your only illumination would come from a small, flickering beeswax or tallow candle. This poor lighting would strain your eyes, making reading, sewing, or any detailed work difficult and contributing to chronic eye strain and headaches. Imagine trying to read sacred texts for hours by the flickering glow of a single candle, your vision blurring in the dimness. It really sucked to go blind for God. This austere and isolated living environment was explicitly designed for spiritual contemplation and detachment from worldly comforts. The simplicity of your surroundings was meant to eliminate distractions, to foster humility, and to focus your mind solely on God. The cold, the hard bed, the dimness, all were intended to be constant reminders of your vows and the spiritual path you had chosen. But for you, the human being, this asceticism came at a profound physical and psychological cost. One common misconception is that all medieval monastic cells were identical and equally austere. In reality, the degree of austerity varied significantly depending on the monastic order. Cistercians were generally stricter than Benedictines, the wealth of the convent, and the period. Older, poorer convents might have truly Spartan conditions, while wealthier, later medieval convents could offer slightly more comfortable, though still basic cells. Furthermore, during periods of reform or laxity, some nuns might have managed to acquire more personal comforts. However, the foundational ideal of austerity remained, and deviation was generally frowned upon. Historians still meticulously study monastic rules, archaeological findings from convent excavations analyzing cell sizes, heating remnants, and waste pits, and personal accounts when available from reformers or critics to understand the precise living conditions and varying degrees of austerity experienced by medieval nuns across different orders and regions. Furthermore, the lack of privacy within the communal living arrangements of a convent could also be a subtle torment. While you had your individual cell, much of your day was spent in communal spaces: the choir, the refectory, the chapter house, the cloister. Even in your cell, the thin walls might offer little soundproofing, meaning the sounds of your sisters coughing, praying, moving would constantly permeate your supposed private space. This constant proximity, while fostering communal bonds, also denied true solitude and personal retreat, making it difficult to find genuine peace or unobserved moments. The psychological toll of living in such a perpetually uncomfortable and isolating environment would be immense. The constant cold, the hard bed, the dimness, the lack of personal space all would contribute to a pervasive sense of physical discomfort that would never truly dissipate. This physical misery, coupled with the profound loneliness and forced introspection, could lead to feelings of profound melancholy, spiritual despair, or a sense of being utterly trapped. Your very home, meant to be a sanctuary, became a place of relentless physical and mental endurance, a constant reminder of your profound sacrifice. The dampness of the stone walls also contributed to the physical misery and the pervasive odor, as discussed in the episode on medieval castles. This constant moisture, combined with the lack of sunlight, fostered mildew and a general musty smell, permeating your clothes and bedding and exacerbating any respiratory issues. Your personal space, however diligently you might try to keep it clean, was perpetually infiltrated by the pervasive dampness and associated smells, further contributing to your physical discomfort. So, your daily life as a medieval nun was profoundly brutal and silent because your very home, the cell, was an austere, cramped, and often perpetually cold prison designed for spiritual contemplation through physical discomfort, its cold stone walls, hard bed, dim lighting, and lack of heating ensured a continuous struggle against the elements and physical misery. This profound physical austerity, ensuring a life of constant bodily discomfort, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your commitment, transforming your sacred dwelling into a tangible reminder of your profound self-sacrifice. Even as your body shivered in your cold cell and your spirit submitted to rigid obedience, your life as a medieval nun was dominated by the relentless demands of the divine office. Forget peaceful, quiet time. Your spiritual devotion was a grueling, continuous cycle of prayer, often performed throughout the night, leading to profound sleep deprivation and making your commitment an undeniably brutal and silent life. Imagine your daily routine, utterly dictated by the ringing of bells and the strict schedule of liturgical prayer. Your day would begin not with the sunrise, but in the deep, freezing darkness of the night, long before the first hint of dawn. Around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., the convent bells would clang, sharply jolting you awake from your hard, uncomfortable bed in your unheated cell. This was the call to matins or vigils, the first and longest of the 8 canonical hours of prayer. You would rise, pull on your habit, and make your way in silence through the cold. Dark cloisters to the convent choir. It truly sucked to be a human alarm clock for God. Once in the choir, you would stand or kneel for hours, chanting psalms, reciting prayers, and listening to readings from scripture and commentaries. This was a complex, lengthy service, performed entirely from memory or by reading from precious, heavy liturgical books in dimly lit conditions. Your voice would join with your sisters in a monotone chant, a perpetual drone that filled the cold, echoing space. Imagine fighting against sleep, your head nodding, your body shivering, your eyes burning from the darkness and the strain of reading tiny script, knowing that any lapse in attention or a sign of tiredness could be seen as a spiritual failing. This cycle of prayer was relentless, punctuated throughout the day and night by subsequent hours or services, lauds before dawn following matins, another service of praise. Prime at sunrise, the first hour of daylight, a shorter service marking the beginning of the workday. Terce mid-morning around 9 a.m., sex midday around 12 p.m., none mid-afternoon around 3 p.m. Vespers at sunset, an evening service of hymns and psalms. Compline before bed, the final service of the day, a prayer for a peaceful night. And then, after a few short hours of sleep, the cycle would begin again with matins in the middle of the night. This meant your sleep was constantly fragmented and often severely limited. You rarely, if ever, experienced a long, uninterrupted night of restorative sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation would be a constant companion, leading to perpetual fatigue, impaired concentration, and a general dullness of mind and body. Your vigilance for God was bought at the cost of your own well-being. It really sucked to be constantly tired for Jesus. The physical toll of this schedule was immense. You would spend countless hours standing or kneeling on cold, hard stone floors, performing repetitive bows and gestures, Your voice, perpetually engaged in chanting, would suffer from strain and hoarseness. Your eyes would ache from reading in dim light. Your body, deprived of adequate rest and warmth, would be in a constant state of weariness, making every physical task more arduous and every spiritual duty a struggle against exhaustion. This rigorous schedule, designed for spiritual elevation, inadvertently broke down your physical health. The monotony of the prayers itself, while spiritually profound, could also be mentally exhausting. Reciting the same psalms, the same hymns, the same liturgical texts, day after day, year after year, for decades, would test your mental resilience, while deep contemplation was encouraged. The sheer repetition could lead to a spiritual numbness, a battle against your own mind's tendency to wander or become bored. Even during sacred moments, the discipline to adhere to this schedule was absolute. Missing an hour, arriving late, or falling asleep during services would be considered serious infractions, leading to various forms of punishment, as we'll discuss in Chapter 6. The constant presence of your abbess and your sister nuns would ensure compliance, adding a layer of communal pressure to your individual struggle against fatigue. You were part of a synchronized spiritual machine, and any deviation was immediately noted. One common misconception is that medieval monastic life was primarily about peaceful contemplation and quiet study, while study and reflection were certainly parts of the daily routine. Particularly for literate nuns, the core of monastic life revolved around the demanding, often physically arduous, performance of the divine office. This liturgical cycle was the central activity, consuming the vast majority of a nun's day and dictating her sleep patterns. The emphasis was on communal prayer and strict adherence to the monastic rule, often at the expense of individual leisure or extended periods of quiet intellectual pursuit. Historians still meticulously study various monastic rules, like the Rule of St. Benedict, which lays out the precise schedule of hours and archaeological findings eschew choir stalls in convents to understand the exact demands of the divine office and its central role in shaping the daily lives of medieval nuns. Furthermore, the very cold of the convent buildings, as discussed in Chapter 3, exacerbated the sleep deprivation. Waking up in an unheated cell in the middle of the night, your body already chilled, would make the transition to the cold choir incredibly difficult, and falling back asleep in the few hours remaining before the next service would be even harder. The physical discomfort amplified the spiritual demands, creating a relentless cycle of cold and exhaustion. The psychological toll of perpetual sleep deprivation would be immense. You would live in a constant fog of fatigue, your concentration impaired, your emotions dulled, and your spirit worn down. The struggle to stay awake during long services, the guilt of feeling tired during prayer, and the knowledge that your body was never truly rested would lead to chronic stress and a pervasive sense of weariness. This constant battle against your own physical limits, in the name of divine devotion, was a profound and defining misery. Your mind and body were perpetually tired instruments for God's glory. The physical strain on your voice from chanting for hours each day, year after year, also contributed to your decay. You would suffer from chronic hoarseness, a persistent ache in your throat, and potentially long-term vocal damage, making your sacred hymns a source of constant discomfort. Your instrument of praise was literally being worn out by perpetual use. So, your life as a medieval nun was profoundly brutal and silent because your spiritual devotion was consumed by the relentless demands of the divine office, the continuous cycle of prayer, performed throughout the night in cold, dim conditions, led to profound sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and chronic discomfort. This unyielding, physically demanding, and a monotonous routine, ensuring your perpetual vigilance for God, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your commitment, transforming your sacred calling into a tireless, soul-crushing ordeal, even as your body struggled with sleep deprivation and your voice strained from endless chanting. Your life as a medieval nun was filled with another kind of demand monastic labor. Forget serene contemplation as your sole purpose. Your days were consumed by demanding physical work and mundane tasks, essential for the convent's self-sufficiency, but profoundly brutal and silent. Imagine your daily routine after the morning prayers. Your hands, dedicated to God, were also dedicated to relentless, often repetitive, labor. The ideal of monastic life was often self-sufficiency, meaning the convent and you, its inhabitant, had to produce much of what it consumed. This involved a wide array of physical tasks that left you perpetually tired and aching. It truly sucked to be a human workhorse for God. Your labor could encompass various demanding activities. Farming and gardening. Many convents owned extensive lands. You might spend hours in the fields, cultivating crops, tending to livestock, or managing vineyards. This involved arduous physical work like plowing, though often by oxen. You'd still handle implements, sowing seeds, weeding, and harvesting. Your hands would be rough and calloused, your back aching from constant bending and lifting. If the convent had its own grist mill, you might spend hours grinding grain, a repetitive and physically demanding task. Imagine toiling under the sun, your habit dusty, your body aching, just like any peasant. But without the hope of your own family's comfort, it really sucked to farm for divine sustenance. Textile production. Weaving and spinning were common tasks for nuns, producing cloth for habits, altar cloths, and sometimes for sale. This involved long hours hunched over a loom, the repetitive motions causing strain on your hands, wrists, and back, and the dust from the fibers irritating your lungs. The meticulous nature of the work, often done in dimly lit conditions, also contributed to eye strain. Copying manuscripts for literate nuns, especially in wealthier convents. Copying manuscripts was a crucial and highly valued form of labor. Imagine spending hours each day in the scriptorium, meticulously transcribing Latin texts onto parchment, by flickering candlelight or dim natural light. This demanded immense concentration, fine motor skills, and incredible patience. Your eyes would ache, your back would stiffen from being hunched over the desk, and your fingers would cramp from holding the quill. This intellectual labor, while prestigious, was physically demanding and contributed to eye decay and musculoskeletal issues. It truly sucked to go blind for books you couldn't keep. Domestic chores, the sheer running of a convent, housing dozens or hundreds of women, involved endless domestic labor. You would be responsible for cooking, cleaning, washing laundry, often in cold water, scrubbing by hand, fetching water from wells, and maintaining the communal spaces. These tasks were physically demanding, often monotonous, and never-ending. Regardless of your rank or health, crafting and artisan work, some convents specialized in producing specific goods like embroidery, illuminated manuscripts, medicines from herbs, or religious artifacts for sale. Your labor might involve intricate, detailed handiwork, requiring immense precision and long hours, contributing to eye strain and repetitive motion injuries. The monotony and repetition of these tasks were profound. Day after day, year after year, you would perform the same arduous duties driven by the monastic rule and the needs of the community. There was little variation, little personal choice in your assignments. Your labor was a form of spiritual discipline, a way to occupy your body and prevent idleness. But it came at the cost of immense physical fatigue and mental tedium. The lack of proper tools and technology exacerbated the physical toll. You worked with rudimentary agricultural implements, hand looms, and simple writing tools, requiring immense brute force and endurance. There were no modern machines to lighten the load, no ergonomic designs to reduce strain. Your own body was the primary engine of production, and it was pushed to its limits daily. One common misconception is that all medieval nuns spent their days exclusively in prayer and contemplation. While spiritual devotion was central, monastic communities were largely self-sufficient economic units that required extensive manual labor to sustain themselves. Nuns engaged in a wide range of practical tasks, from farming and baking to weaving and copying, contributing directly to the convent's livelihood. The balance between prayer and labor varied by order and period, but work was always an essential, disciplined component of monastic life. Historians still meticulously study monastic cartularies, registers of property, and economic transactions. Archaeological findings from convent sites, remnants of workshops, mills, and agricultural tools, and monastic rules to understand the precise economic activities and daily labor demanded of medieval nuns, confirming their pervasive involvement in physical work. Furthermore, the austerity of the convent environment, cold cells, damp stone, poor lighting, as discussed in Chapter 3, compounded the misery of labor. You would perform these demanding tasks, often in uncomfortable conditions, your body perpetually cold, your eyes strained, and your muscles aching. The physical discomfort of your dwelling followed you into your work, ensuring there was no true escape from the pervasive misery. The lack of medical care for occupational injuries or chronic ailments, as we'll discuss in Chapter 8, further added to the misery. A strained back from lifting heavy loads, chronic hand pain from repetitive tasks, or severe eye strain from manuscript copying would be endured, often without effective treatment, leading to lifelong discomfort or disability, shortening your productive life within the convent. Your body, broken by labor, was simply expected to continue. The psychological toll of this endless, monotonous labor was immense. You would constantly battle fatigue, boredom, and the suppression of personal desires. Your life was defined by the relentless cycle of work and prayer, with little room for individual pursuits or a sense of personal accomplishment beyond contributing to the convent's collective well-being. This constant grind would erode your spirit, leaving you perpetually weary and perhaps quietly longing for a different existence. Your labor, while an act of devotion, was also a profound source of misery. So, your daily life as a medieval nun was profoundly brutal and silent because your spiritual devotion was inextricably linked to monastic labor. From grueling farming and textile production to meticulous manuscript copying and endless domestic chores, your days were consumed by demanding physical work that pushed your body to its limits, causing chronic pain and exhaustion. This pervasive, physically destructive toil, essential for the convent's self-sufficiency, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your commitment, ensuring that your sacred life was a continuous act of unyielding physical service. Even as you toiled ceaselessly through monastic labor and your body ached from chronic strain, your spiritual life as a medieval nun was profoundly shaped by the silent rule. Forget open conversation or easy emotional expression. The strict monastic discipline of enforced solitude and suppressed voice made your commitment an undeniably brutal and silent life. Imagine the pervasive atmosphere within the convent. From your earliest days as a novice, you would be taught the fundamental importance of silence. This wasn't merely about avoiding unnecessary chatter. It was a core spiritual discipline designed to promote contemplation, prevent idle gossip, and foster a constant awareness of God's presence. There were specific times and places where silence was strictly enforced in the choir during the divine office, in the refectory dining hall during meals, in the cloisters, and often in your cell. Your interactions with your sisters would be limited to necessity, conducted in hushed tones or through gestures, rather than open conversation. It truly sucked to be told to shut up for God. This strict adherence to silence meant a profound suppression of your natural human need for communication and emotional expression. You could not easily share your joys, your sorrows, your frustrations, or your doubts with your fellow nuns. While there might be periods of recreation or designated times for necessary conversation, the overarching rule of silence permeated your daily existence, forcing you to internalize your thoughts and feelings. Imagine living for decades, surrounded by dozens of women, yet rarely engaging in spontaneous, heartfelt conversation. This constant repression of your voice, this lack of emotional outlet, was a profound psychological burden. It really sucked to feel emotionally muted. The purpose of this silence was believed to be spiritual elevation. By eliminating worldly distractions and the temptations of idle talk, you were meant to foster a deeper connection with God, to listen more intently for divine inspiration, and to cultivate inner peace. However, for you, the human being, this enforced solitude could easily lead to profound emotional isolation, even in a communal setting. The lack of genuine, uninhibited conversation could leave you feeling deeply alone, unable to forge the kind of intimate bonds that sustain human well-being. Your identity was meant to be subsumed by the monastic community and your devotion to God. The silence reinforced this, preventing the emergence of individual personalities or the formation of strong, independent opinions that might challenge the collective. You were a part of a larger, disciplined whole, and your unique voice was deliberately suppressed to foster conformity and obedience. This stripping away of your individuality, however spiritually intended, was a profound personal sacrifice. It really sucked to be a nameless face in a crowd of habits. The lack of emotional expression and the strict rules of silence could also make it difficult to address personal conflicts or grievances within the convent. If you had a disagreement with a sister, or if you felt unjustly treated by your abbess, the avenues for open communication or resolution would be limited by the rule of silence. This could lead to festering resentments, unspoken tensions, and a pervasive atmosphere of suppressed conflict, further eroding genuine camaraderie within the community. One common misconception is that all medieval convents were perfectly silent places where nuns never spoke. In reality, the strictness of the rule varied by order and by convent, and periods of recreation known as locutorium or parlor, where speaking was permitted, existed. However, the ideal of silence was pervasive, and its enforcement was a constant feature of monastic life. Particularly during religious services and work periods, the very existence of rules against idle talk implies that conversation was a natural human tendency that constantly had to be disciplined. Historians still meticulously study various monastic rules like the rule of Saint Benedict and later variations, and the records of monastic life, e.g., visitations by bishops that sometimes noted rule breaking To understand the precise enforcement of silence and its practical implications for daily life in medieval convents. Furthermore, the physical environment of the convent, with its cold stone walls and often damp atmosphere, as discussed in Chapter 3, exacerbated the feeling of isolation. The echoes in the cloisters, the hushed movements, and the lack of warmth could contribute to a pervasive sense of loneliness, amplifying the psychological impact of the enforced silence. Your physical surroundings reflected your internal emotional landscape. The lack of external contact, as we'll discuss further in Chapter 8, further intensified this isolation. You were largely cut off from your birth family, from secular society, and from news of the outside world. Your primary interactions were with your silent sisters and the male clergy, who also observed rules of silence or limited interaction. This compounded your sense of being utterly detached from the world, existing in a self-contained, often emotionally barren, bubble. The psychological toll of this forced silence and emotional repression would be immense. You would battle feelings of profound loneliness, sadness, and perhaps even resentment. The inability to truly express yourself, to share your inner world, could lead to a sense of being constantly constrained, perpetually bottling up your emotions. This internal struggle, this profound self-denial, would erode your spirit, leaving you emotionally numb or silently despairing. Ensuring your commitment was not just physically brutal, but deeply psychologically isolating. So, your life as a medieval nun was profoundly brutal and silent because your spiritual devotion was governed by the silent rule, the strict enforcement of silence in most areas of the convent, limiting conversation and emotional expression, created a profound sense of isolation and psychological burden. This relentless suppression of your voice and individuality, though intended for spiritual purification, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your commitment, ensuring your sacred life was a continuous act of self-denial and emotional solitude, even as your body was ravaged by chronic cold and relentless labor, and your spirit withered under the silent rule. Your life as a medieval nun was perpetually governed by fasting and penance. Forget indulgent meals or personal comfort. Your commitment to deliberate deprivation and self-inflicted discomfort was a core spiritual discipline, designed to purify your soul through bodily subjugation, making your commitment an undeniably brutal and silent life. Imagine your daily diet. Your vow of poverty meant your food was already simple and often monotonous, as discussed in the episode on medieval castles, which shared many living conditions with convents. But beyond this basic austerity, the monastic rules imposed numerous, strict fasting days throughout the year. This wasn't merely about abstaining from certain foods, it was about deliberate deprivation, a physical act of sacrifice mirroring spiritual devotion. It truly sucked to be perpetually hungry for God. Lent. The 40 days leading up to Easter was the most significant fasting period. During Lent, you would typically be forbidden from consuming meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy products. Your diet would primarily consist of coarse bread, some vegetables often preserved or dried, legumes, peas, beans, and fish if available. Imagine working tirelessly through the cold, damp winter, your body already exhausted, only to be denied vital sources of protein and fat for weeks on end. This sustained deprivation would lead to profound physical weakness, exacerbating any underlying nutritional deficiencies. Advent. The period leading up to Christmas also involved fasting, though often less strict than Lent. Vigils and Ember Days, many other individual days or weeks throughout the year, were designated as fast days, requiring similar abstention from certain foods, general abstinence. Even outside strict fasting periods, many monastic rules encourage general abstinence from rich foods, spices, and any indulgence that might bring undue pleasure. Promoting a diet that was constantly plain and simple, the purpose of these fasts was profoundly spiritual to chastise the flesh, purify the soul, and draw closer to God. By denying the body its desires, nuns sought to transcend worldly temptations and focus entirely on spiritual contemplation and prayer. It was believed that physical suffering could cleanse sins and lead to greater spiritual merit. However, for you, the human being, this deliberate deprivation caused immense physical discomfort and systemic weakening. Your body was a tool for spiritual advancement, not a vessel for comfort or pleasure. It really sucked to make your stomach suffer for your soul. Beyond fasting, some monastic practices encouraged various forms of penance, or self-inflicted discomfort and mild physical punishment, again, for spiritual purification. Sleeping on hard surfaces, as discussed. Your cell likely had a hard wooden pallet or straw mattress. This deliberate lack of comfort was a mild form of penance, ensuring your body was never truly at ease. Cold bathing, while not universally practiced, some stricter orders might encourage bathing in cold water or abstaining from bathing for long periods. Again, to subdue the flesh and promote humility. Wearing rough clothing, your simple woolen habit, often coarse against the skin, was a constant physical reminder of your vow of poverty and an implicit act of minor penance. Promoting discomfort, vigils and prolonged kneeling. The long hours of prayer during the divine office often involved standing or kneeling on cold, hard stone floors, causing joint pain, stiffness, and physical fatigue. Deliberately endured for spiritual merit, these practices, while seen as acts of piety, had inevitable physical consequences. Chronic undernourishment from frequent fasting led to malnutrition, a persistent lack of essential vitamins, minerals, and diverse proteins, leading to conditions like scurvy vitamin C deficiency, anemia, iron deficiency, and overall physical weakness, weakened immune system, your body's defenses already compromised by cold, sleep deprivation, and physical labor would be further depleted, making you highly susceptible to infectious diseases that thrived in medieval convents. Digestive issues, constant changes in diet, periods of extreme hunger, and consumption of monotonous, coarse foods could lead to chronic gastrointestinal distress. Physical exhaustion, the combination of fasting, labor, and sleep deprivation ensured your body was in a perpetual state of weariness, making every physical movement arduous. One common misconception is that medieval nuns starved themselves to death as a sign of piety, while extreme asceticism and martyrdom were sometimes praised, and some individuals undoubtedly pushed their bodies too far. The monastic rules, like the Rule of St. Benedict, generally aim for a diet that, while austere, was sufficient to sustain life and allow for work and prayer. The problem was the nutritional inadequacy by modern standards and the cumulative effect of constant fasting periods on already vulnerable bodies. Historians still meticulously study monastic dietary regulations, from convent cartularies and kitchen accounts, and bioarchaeological analysis of nuns' skeletal remains when identifiable, to understand the precise nutritional intake and overall health status of medieval nuns. Finding evidence of widespread dietary stress and related illnesses. Furthermore, the psychological toll of deliberate deprivation would be immense. You would constantly battle feelings of hunger, physical discomfort, and the suppression of your natural human desires, the sins of gluttony or indulgence, which might seem trivial to others, would be constant internal struggles, leading to self-reproach or spiritual anxiety. This constant battle against your own body's natural instincts, this profound self-denial, would lead to a pervasive sense of weariness, making your sacred life a perpetual internal struggle. The contrast between the spiritual purity sought through these practices and the physical suffering inflicted was stark. You were deliberately weakening your body, not for external torment, but for an internal, spiritual gain. This made the physical acts of fasting and penance a unique form of self-imposed misery, a continuous martyrdom for the sake of your soul's perceived salvation, the very success of a nun in adhering strictly to these rules. Enduring hunger and discomfort without complaint was often seen as a sign of her spiritual strength and piety. This social and spiritual validation, however, ironically encouraged further self-deprivation, pushing individuals to greater extremes of physical denial, even if it led to profound suffering or undermined their long-term health. Your suffering became a testament to your faith, making you a holy example at your own physical expense. So your life as a medieval nun was profoundly brutal and silent because your spiritual devotion was consumed by fasting and penance, the deliberate deprivation of food, the rigid adherence to numerous fast days, and the acceptance of physical discomfort as spiritual discipline systematically eroded your body, causing chronic malnutrition and pervasive physical decay. This constant, unyielding act of self-subjugation, transforming your body into an instrument of spiritual purification, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your commitment. Ensuring your sacred life was a continuous act of personal denial, even as your body suffered the relentless cold, the gnawing hunger, and the constant toil of penance. Your life as a medieval nun was perpetually stalked by an insidious, often unseen, enemy disease and decay. Forget a pristine, healthy existence. The unsanitary conditions of the convent, coupled with deliberate austerity and primitive medical care, ensured that illness was rampant, making your commitment an undeniably brutal and silent life. Imagine your daily reality within the convent walls, the very structure of your sacred dwelling, while built of solid stone, contributed directly to the spread of illness, the cold, damp stone as discussed in Chapter 3, and recalling the miserable, stinking reality of living in a medieval castle episode, radiated a constant chill, particularly in unheated cells and communal areas, contributing to a pervasive dampness that seeped into your bones. This persistent cold, coupled with insufficient warmth from meager heating, weakened your body's natural defenses, making you highly susceptible to respiratory infections. It truly sucked to freeze your way to holiness. Sanitation in medieval convents, even well-managed ones, was rudimentary by modern standards. While communal privies existed, they were often basic, rarely cleaned thoroughly, and contributed to a pervasive stench in certain areas. Water for washing was often drawn from wells or rivers that could be contaminated by waste, unknowingly becoming vectors for disease. The close proximity of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of nuns living, eating, and sleeping in shared spaces like dormitories or communal cells created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of pathogens. Imagine living in a crowded dormitory, where a single sick nun with a cough or a fever could quickly infect dozens of her sisters. This pervasive filth, however unseen, was a constant threat. It really sucked to share your germs with everyone. Your diet, meticulously controlled by monastic rules, while providing basic sustenance, was often nutritionally deficient. The frequent fasting periods, as discussed in Chapter 7, the emphasis on simple, often monotonous, fare, and the general lack of diverse fresh fruits, vegetables, and consistent protein, led to chronic malnutrition. This would manifest as vitamin deficiencies, scurvy, Vitamin C deficiency was common, causing bleeding gums, loose teeth, reopening old wounds, and profound fatigue. Anemia iron deficiency led to chronic weakness and pallor. Weakened immune system. Your body's defenses, already compromised by cold, sleep deprivation from the divine office, constant physical labor, and insufficient nutrition, were severely depleted. This meant that common illnesses that a well-nourished body might typically fight off could quickly escalate into life-threatening conditions. You were perpetually vulnerable, a walking target for every pathogen. This weakened state made you highly susceptible to a wide array of infectious diseases that thrived in medieval convents. Respiratory illnesses, colds would swiftly escalate into severe bronchitis. Pneumonia or pleurisy, the cold, damp air, combined with smoky heating if present and close proximity, created ideal conditions for these lung infections. The constant coughing and labored breathing of sick nuns would be a pervasive, terrifying sound in the silent corridors. Gastrointestinal diseases due to contaminated water and unsanitary food handling. Outbreaks of dysentery, the bloody flux, causing severe diarrhea and dehydration, typhoid fever, and various parasitic infections were common. These would rapidly debilitate and kill nuns, especially those already weakened by malnutrition or old age. Other fevers, undiagnosed viral and bacterial infections would sweep through the community, leaving nuns racked with chills, drenching sweats, and delirium, with no effective medicine to offer relief. The mortality rate in medieval convents could be alarmingly high during epidemics, often mirroring or even exceeding those in secular communities due to the enclosed, crowded nature of monastic life. Entire sections of the convent could be decimated by a single outbreak. You would witness your sisters, those with whom you prayed and toiled, succumb rapidly to agonizing diseases, their bodies wasted, their suffering profound, knowing that the same fate could be yours at any moment. It truly sucked to live in a sanctuary that was also a death trap. Medical knowledge and care in the medieval period were primitive. While some convents had infirmaries and nuns with knowledge of herbal remedies, often passed down through generations within the monastic community, effective treatments for severe infectious diseases were non-existent. Healers, whether local physicians, barber surgeons, or fellow nuns with some medical skill, might prescribe herbal concoctions, some effective, many not, perform rudimentary surgeries, or offer prayers and spiritual interventions. However, there were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no sterile operating rooms, and no effective pain management beyond perhaps some opiates if you fell severely ill. Your survival depended entirely on your body's own resilience and immense luck. Many nuns suffered prolonged, agonizing illnesses or succumbed to complications from seemingly minor ailments. It really sucked to be a patient in ancient times. Even minor injuries, from falls on slippery stone floors or accidents during manual labor, could become life-threatening due to infection. A simple cut could fester into a pus-filled abscess, cellulitis, or ultimately fatal sepsis, a systemic infection that would cause organ failure and agonizing death. Your body, already compromised by austerity and demanding routines, had little defense against these unseen microbial assaults. One common misconception is that medieval convents, being religious institutions, were inherently healthier than secular communities. While some might have had better access to food in times of famine due to their land holdings, their communal living, often in cold, damp stone buildings with rudimentary sanitation, made them highly susceptible to infectious diseases. The prevalence of chronic illness and relatively high mortality rates from disease are well documented in monastic records and archaeological studies of monastic cemeteries. Historians still meticulously study monastic infirmary records, detailed mortality lists, and bioarchaeological analysis of nuns' skeletal remains, which often show signs of chronic infections, nutritional deficiencies, and bone stress related to physical labor to reconstruct the precise health profiles and impact of disease on medieval monastic communities, confirming the brutal health realities of convent life. Furthermore, the lack of true privacy in communal living, as discussed in Chapter 6, exacerbated the spread of disease. Nuns shared dormitories, refectories, and even bathing facilities. A single sick individual could rapidly transmit pathogens to her sisters, ensuring that once an illness entered the convent, it often swept through the entire community. This close confinement, while fostering spiritual bonds, also created a perfect environment for contagion, making your spiritual home a constant source of physical peril. The psychological toll of constantly battling sickness, of watching your beloved sister suffer and die from agonizing diseases, and of knowing that your own body was always at risk, would be immense. This pervasive atmosphere of illness and death eroded morale, fostered despair, and made every day a grim countdown to the inevitable. Your existence was a perpetual struggle against unseen enemies, transforming your sacred dwelling into a place of constant fear and misery. The sounds of coughing, the smell of sickness, and the sight of emaciated bodies would be a constant, harrowing reality. Even if you yourself survived, this grim reality underscored the profound physical misery beneath the surface of monastic piety. So, your life as a medieval nun was profoundly brutal and silent, because disease and decay were constant companions. The pervasive cold, the chronic malnutrition from fasting, and the unsanitary living conditions made you perpetually vulnerable to rampant respiratory, gastrointestinal, and deficiency diseases that claimed lives at an astonishing rate. This horrifying prevalence of illness and the primitive medical care ensured that your sacred convent, intended as a sanctuary, was also a perpetually unhealthy and often deadly place to inhabit, making every season a profound and agonizing fight for your very existence. Even as your body slowly decayed from chronic illness and your spirit withered under the weight of monastic discipline, your supposedly cloistered life as a medieval nun was never truly safe from the outside world. Forget absolute sanctuary. The convent walls were often permeable, constantly threatened by external forces from brutal wars and devastating raids to political upheavals and religious reformations, making your commitment an undeniably brutal and silent life. Imagine the profound anxiety that would settle over you during times of war or local conflict. While convents were theoretically sacred spaces, they were not always immune to the violence raging outside their walls. Armies, whether friendly or hostile, might pass through or near your lands, bringing with them the constant threat of pillage and destruction. Rogue soldiers, desperate mercenaries, or invading forces might view the convent as a tempting target for its wealthlands, treasures, stored food, or simply for shelter. Your convent could be raided, its lands plundered, its buildings damaged or even burned. Imagine the terror of hearing the distant sounds of marching armies, the shouts of men, knowing your sacred home could become a battlefield, its peace shattered by violence and destruction. It truly sucked to pray for peace that never came, for violence and desecration. Nuns, despite their sacred vows, could be vulnerable to violence, rape, or abduction by undisciplined soldiers or desperate raiders. The sanctity of the convent offered little protection against the brutality of war. The church might condemn such acts, but real-world chaos often overrode divine law. Imagine the constant fear for your personal safety, knowing that the very walls meant to protect you could be breached at any moment. Disease armies on the move were notorious carriers of disease, fevers, dysentery, and even devastating plagues like the Black Death would follow in their wake, sweeping through the surrounding countryside and inevitably reaching your convent. Exacerbated by the crowded conditions and weakened immune systems as discussed in Chapter 8. You might escape the sword, only to succumb to an unseen pathogen brought by passing soldiers. Beyond direct military threats, convents were often entangled in feudal politics and power struggles. Your convent might own extensive lands, or receive patronage from a powerful noble family. This meant you were often caught in the crossfire of secular disputes. A new lord might challenge your convent's land rights. A rival family might seek to undermine your abbess's authority, or a king might demand financial contributions or shelter for his troops, draining your limited resources. The peaceful pursuit of God was often interrupted by the mundane, yet pressing, demands of worldly power. It really sucked to be a spiritual pawn in a land dispute, the most profound external threat, particularly in later medieval periods and during the Reformation, was religious and political upheaval. The church, while powerful, was not monolithic. Internal reforms, schisms like the Western Schism, and later the Protestant Reformation, challenged the very existence of monastic institutions. Imagine living through a period where your very faith, your way of life, was declared heretical or obsolete by powerful rulers or new religious movements, suppression and dissolution during periods like the dissolution of the monasteries in England 1536-1541 under King Henry VIII. Hundreds of convents and monasteries were systematically dissolved, their lands and wealth confiscated by the crown. Nuns were often forcibly expelled from their homes, stripped of their vows, and left with meager pensions or nothing. Forced to reintegrate into a secular society they had abandoned decades prior, often without family or means of support. Imagine being told, after 30 years of devotion, that your sacred home was being closed, your vows invalid, and your life's purpose nullified by a king's decree. This was a profound, existential catastrophe. It really sucked to have your spiritual path forcibly ended. Persecution. In other regions during the Reformation, nuns might face persecution, violence, or forced conversion by Protestant authorities who viewed monasticism as an outdated or corrupt practice. Your choice to dedicate your life to God could become an act of defiance, risking your safety and freedom. This meant your sacred enclosure, your intended sanctuary, was perpetually vulnerable to forces far beyond your control. The walls that protected you from bandits in one era might become a target for royal greed in another. Your commitment to a silent, contemplative life was constantly interrupted by the brutal, noisy realities of the secular world, leaving you in a perpetual state of anxiety and insecurity. One common misconception is that medieval convents were perfectly insulated havens of peace, entirely separate from secular society. In reality, while they sought spiritual retreat, convents were deeply embedded in feudal society, holding land, receiving patronage, and subject to secular laws and political whims. Their wealth and strategic locations often made them targets during conflicts, and their very existence was tied to the political and religious stability of the surrounding region. Historians still meticulously study monastic charters, visitation records by bishops and royal officials, and accounts of conflict exagi. During the 100 Years' War or various internal feudal conflicts, to understand the precise nature of external threats and political pressures faced by medieval convents. Furthermore, the psychological toll of constantly living under the shadow of these external threats would be immense. The fear of invasion, the anxiety about political shifts, and the profound trauma of witnessing the dissolution of other monastic houses would erode your peace of mind. You would live with a constant sense of precariousness, knowing that your sacred life could be disrupted or entirely ended by forces you could neither control nor comprehend. This pervasive insecurity, a stark contrast to the supposed tranquility of monastic life, was a defining and deeply miserable aspect of your existence. The loss of your spiritual community, whether through plague, war, or forced dissolution, was also a profound horror. Your sisters in Christ were your chosen family, the only real connections you had. To see them sicken and die, or to be forcibly scattered, would be a heartbreaking experience, leaving you utterly alone in your commitment. This emotional devastation, born from external chaos, added another layer to your already heavy burden. So, your life as a medieval nun was profoundly brutal and silent because it was constantly threatened by external forces, from violent wars and destructive raids to complex feudal politics and the ultimate upheaval of religious reformation. Your sacred sanctuary was perpetually vulnerable, this pervasive insecurity, ensuring that your commitment was a continuous battle against the chaos of the secular world, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your commitment, often culminating in the tragic dissolution of your spiritual home and identity. You've endured a forced calling into a life you didn't choose, suffered through unbreakable vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, shivered in your cold, cramped cell, battled constant sleep deprivation from the relentless divine office, toiled endlessly in monastic labor, wrestled with the profound emotional silence, embraced self-deprivation through fasting and penance, withered from disease and decay in unsanitary conditions, and faced terrifying external threats from wars, raids, and the ultimate upheaval of reformation. As the distant chants fade and the phantom chill of your cell finally dissipates, a profound, lingering truth settles upon you: the life of a medieval nun, for all its spiritual devotion, was a profound, isolated, and utterly brutal existence, ultimately serving as a holy prison. Consider the fundamental paradox that defined every aspect of your life. You entered the convent seeking spiritual purity, devotion to God, and perhaps an escape from the harsh realities of secular marriage and societal pressures. And in many ways, you achieved a form of sanctuary. You were dedicated to prayer, surrounded by spiritual texts, and lived within a community of women dedicated to God. This could offer a deep sense of purpose and spiritual fulfillment. It truly sucked to find God through such suffering. However, this sanctuary came at an immense, pervasive cost, profound personal sacrifice, and relentless physical and psychological torment. Your vows stripped you of your personal freedom, your right to choose your path, and your most fundamental human desires for romantic love, intimacy, and motherhood. You were condemned to a life of perpetual celibacy, denying the very essence of human connection. Your existence was meticulously controlled by rigid rules, leaving no room for spontaneity or individual expression, turning your spiritual devotion into a relentless, physically demanding performance. Then there's the unyielding physical brutality you endured. Your body was perpetually cold, constantly sleep-deprived, and often malnourished from frequent fasting and austere diets. You toiled endlessly in monastic labor, from farming to copying manuscripts, leading to chronic pain, repetitive strain injuries, and physical decay. You lived in unsanitary conditions, battling rampant diseases and infections that thrived in crowded, damp stone buildings, ensuring a life often plagued by illness and a drastically shortened lifespan. Your physical suffering was a constant companion, a stark contrast to the supposed serenity of monastic life. And what about the crushing emotional and social isolation, the strict rule of silence, meant for spiritual contemplation, led to a profound suppression of your natural need for communication and emotional expression? You lived surrounded by your sisters, yet were often emotionally mute, unable to forge genuine, intimate bonds. Your severance from your birth family was near absolute, leaving you without the warmth of a familial affection. This pervasive loneliness, this inability to truly connect, eroded your spirit, leaving you in a state of silent, profound despair. Your holy solitude was often just agonizing isolation. Finally, the vulnerability to external forces and the grim legacy of erasure. Despite your convent being a sacred space, it was not immune to the brutal realities of the secular world. Wars, raids, and political upheavals could shatter your peace, threaten your safety, or even lead to the forced dissolution of your spiritual home, leaving you stripped of your vows and cast back into a world you no longer knew. Your contribution, your profound personal sacrifice, often remained unsung and anonymous in the grand tapestry of history, overshadowed by the very silence and discipline that defined your life. Your existence was largely recorded in ledgers and charters, not in personal narratives, leaving your individual story largely forgotten. It truly sucked to be erased by history. The paradox of the medieval nun's life is deeply unsettling. They were powerful spiritual figures, wielding influence through prayer and piety, running complex economic institutions, and often serving as centers of learning and charity. Yet, this power and purpose were inextricably linked to profound self-denial, physical hardship, and relentless control. Their choice, or lack thereof, to enter the convent was a complex decision driven by a mix of genuine spiritual calling, economic necessity, and societal pressure. The convent offered sanctuary from the dangers of the secular world, like marriage, childbirth, or destitution for women, but it replaced those dangers with its own unique forms of brutal confinement and relentless discipline, one particularly poignant and often overlooked. Detail is the medieval concept of spiritual marriage between a nun and Christ. While this provided immense theological comfort and purpose, symbolizing a profound personal relationship with the divine, it simultaneously reinforced the absolute denial of earthly intimacy. The nun was expected to channel all her emotional and physical desires towards this abstract, spiritual spouse, a demanding act of psychological reorientation. This concept, however beautiful in its spiritual purity, underscored the profound personal sacrifice of lifelong celibacy, requiring a constant internal discipline to maintain that unique, ultimate bond. Historians still meticulously study medieval mystical texts and nun spiritual writings to understand the precise nature and psychological impact of this spiritual marriage and how individual nuns navigated its profound demands. Ultimately, your life as a medieval nun was a profound paradox. You committed to a sacred calling, seeking spiritual perfection and eternal salvation. Yet, this path was paved with the brutal realities of physical austerity, relentless discipline, chronic illness, and profound emotional and social isolation. Your existence was a continuous act of self-subjugation, a spiritual prison, ensuring that your devotion was bought at the cost of immense personal suffering, transforming your holy life into a miserable and silent reality. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant whispers of ancient chants and the imagined chill of a stone cell finally subside. You are safe, in your own time, far removed from the brutal realities of a medieval nun's existence. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of personal autonomy, the warmth of genuine human connection, and the profound freedom to choose your own path to fulfillment. A stark contrast to the brutal and silent truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night, and have sweet dreams.